The air tastes of iron and fear. In front of you stands a wall, alive, breathing, bristling with 1,000 spear points. It moves not like men, but like one metallic beast, its rhythm forged by Philip, perfected by Alexander. The Macedonian phalanx, an army turned into geometry, has crushed empires from Greece to India. For generations, seeing it meant death. But on one scorching afternoon in Thessaly, that perfect machine met something new, something uglier, more flexible, and born from Rome's endless defeats. In hours, an age ended, not by chance, by evolution. Before empire, Macedonia was a fractured backwater, a patchwork of hill tribes mocked by the cultured Greeks of the south. To Athens and Thebes, Macedonians were barbarians with crowns, half-civilized and wholly forgettable. Then came Philip II, a hostage once held in Thebes, who returned home carrying something more dangerous than resentment. Ideas. He had watched the Theban sacred band drill and fight, had studied how discipline could sculpt men into a single coherent body. But Philip wasn't interested in imitation. He was interested in evolution. He took the short spear, the dory, and stretched it into the sarissa, a monstrous pike nearly 6 meters long. He made armor lighter, drilled year-round, and built a standing army where loyalty belonged not to city or kin, but to the king. 16 men deep, 5 spearheads glinting before you even saw the first face. That was the Macedonian phalanx. Each man's shield overlapped with the one beside him, creating a wall of bronze that advanced as one thought, one breath. The first 5 ranks projected their sarissas forward, while the rear ranks angled theirs upward, forming a moving forest that no cavalry could penetrate and no infantry could outlast. In Philip's mind, this was more than a formation, it was an equation. Geometry turned to murder. Angles, leverage, density. War stripped of chaos and rebuilt into precision. When his new army met the Greeks at Chaeronea in 338 BC, the old world realized too late what it faced. The Theban sacred band, heroes of 100 victories, died to the last man, crushed not by courage, but by system. Then came Alexander. If Philip had forged the machine, his son filled it with lightning. Where his father engineered discipline, Alexander unleashed vision. At 18, he commanded cavalry at Chaeronea. At 20, he became king. And within a decade he had marched from the Aegean to the Indus, dragging the phalanx with him across deserts, mountains, and empires. At Issus, Gaugamela, and the Hydaspes, that same wall of sarissas met and shattered armies many times its size. The Persian hosts, ornate, ancient, and numerous, collapsed before a machine that didn't flinch, didn't break, and didn't forgive. The phalanx held, and Alexander's cavalry hammered. Together they worked like lungs and heart, each movement feeding the next. It wasn't glory alone that won those wars, it was logistics, mathematics, control. The phalanx was an instrument of certainty in a chaotic world, and yet, within that perfection lay a flaw invisible to those inside it. Its strength was its stillness, its unity, its order. It needed open plains, clear communication, a single mind to guide its shape. It thrived when everything went right. But history, like terrain, rarely stays flat. When Alexander died in Babylon at 32, his empire fractured into kingdoms ruled by men who had learned to mimic his tactics, but not his adaptability. The phalanx became ritual. Ranks of pikes marched under the banners of the Diadochi, proud but ossified. And as decades turned into centuries, the world changed. But the phalanx did not. Rome was watching, and Rome was learning. Rome never had a genius like Philip or Alexander. It didn't invent, it absorbed, tested, and adapted. Every scar was a diagram, every defeat a lecture. The city's armies began as a crude imitation of the Greek hoplite line. Citizen farmers holding round shields, fighting shoulder to shoulder. But Italy was not Greece. Its hills broke formations, its enemies, Samnites, Etruscans, Gauls, fought dirty, ambushed columns and struck from ravines. Rigid walls failed, so Rome broke them. The Republic learned to think in layers. Out went the uniform line, in came maniples, small, flexible packets of men, 120 soldiers each, commanded by centurions who could act without waiting for orders from above. Instead of a monolith, the Roman army became a grid, a living mosaic that could bend, rotate, and adapt in real time. The scutum replaced the round hoplite shield, tall, curved, like a door you could punch with. Behind it, the pilum, a throwing spear designed not to be recovered, but to ruin the enemy's shield by bending on impact. And when the distance closed, the gladius did the talking, short, stabbing, cruelly efficient. Rome's enemies learned to fear that rhythm: throw, close, cut. It wasn't artistry, it was industry. The legion didn't need perfect ground, it didn't need perfect timing, it just needed endurance, obedience, and space to improvise. When the Gauls sacked Rome in 390 BC, the city rebuilt stronger. When the Samnites trapped legions in mountain passes, Rome adjusted formations. When King Pyrrhus of Epirus, heir to Alexander's tradition, brought elephants and phalanxes to Italy, the Romans watched, bled, and copied. Pyrrhus won his battles, but lost his war. The Romans lost their battles, but learned how to win the next 1,000. By the time Rome faced Carthage, the Manipular Legion was something terrifying, a weaponized bureaucracy. Commanders could die, and the army would keep fighting, guided by discipline and procedure rather than charisma. No single hero held it together. The machine was the hero. And unlike the phalanx, Rome's system didn't fear imperfection. It assumed it. Every plan was designed to fail gracefully, to adapt when things went wrong. Each soldier understood not just his position, but the positions of the men around him. Each unit could retreat, advance, or pivot without collapsing the line. This was not beauty, it was inevitability. By the time the Roman legions marched east, their enemies still worshipped the memory of Alexander, the shining phalanx, the perfect charge, the godlike commander. Rome arrived with none of that, just scars, discipline, and a new religion, adaptability. And on one summer afternoon in 168 BC, at a place called Pydna, the old world met the new and broke. By the mid-2nd century BC, Macedonia had become a ghost of its former glory, a proud remnant wrapped in the memories of Alexander. The phalanx was still sacred, the sarissa still polished, but the spirit that once conquered worlds had turned brittle. Its king, Perseus of Macedon, inherited more than a throne. He inherited an illusion that the old ways still worked. Perseus was not a fool. He was brave, clever, and cautious to a fault. He believed discipline and tradition could still triumph over Rome's rising tide. When the Roman Republic declared war, the Third Macedonian War, Perseus marched north with 40,000 men, their pikes glittering like silver reeds under the Thessalian sun. Each soldier believed he carried a fragment of Alexander's shadow. Facing him across the plains stood Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a veteran of many forgotten wars. He was no orator, no self-made demigod. He had grown up under the weight of Roman politics, where victory was measured not by glory but by order. He studied maps more than omens. He valued patience over passion. To his men, he was almost unnervingly calm, the kind of commander who seemed to breathe in rhythm with fate itself. For weeks, the two armies stalked each other across the hills and valleys of Thessaly. Perseus sought open plains where the phalanx could stretch its wings, lock shields, and roll forward like an iron avalanche. Paulus refused. He lingered in rough terrain, letting the ground itself become his ally. Each night the Roman camp hummed with drills. Each morning dust from the Macedonian side glittered on the horizon. Paulus knew the truth that Perseus could not yet face. Battles are rarely decided by plans, they are decided by mistakes. And so he waited for one. As days turned into weeks, the tension thickened. The Macedonians were restless. Their formation-based warfare demanded motion, not patience. The Romans, seasoned by decades of attrition, endured. When both armies finally reached the plains near Pydna, neither commander expected the battle to begin that day. Perseus held the high ground, watching the Romans through the shimmering haze. He saw confidence where Paulus saw structure. His scouts reported that the Romans were fatigued, that their horses were thirsty. Paulus, meanwhile, observed the phalanx glittering below, a forest of precision waiting to be unleashed. It was a stalemate made of nerves, the kind of stillness that history loves to shatter by accident. The afternoon was brutal. The sun beat down on armour until it hissed. A Roman pack horse, startled by something unseen, broke free from its tether and bolted toward the nearby river, the Lucus. A handful of soldiers ran after it, shouting, laughing at first. But the Macedonian side also had men near the river, Thracian mercenaries hired for their ferocity and their temper. Shouts turned to insults, insults to stones. A spear was thrown, no one remembered by whom. The spark leapt. Steel met flesh. What began as a scuffle between a few men at a stream rippled outward like a shudder through the earth. Auxiliaries rushed in to support their comrades. Trumpets blared without orders. Dust clouds thickened as more soldiers spilled down the slopes. Soon, the legionaries themselves began to form up instinctively, not for war, but for survival. Perseus saw the movement from his hilltop. His generals hesitated, arguing over whether it was a Roman trick. But the king's blood stirred. Here was the open ground he had prayed for. Here was destiny itself stumbling into his hands. He gave the order. Across the plain, the Macedonian phalanx began to form, shields locking, sarissas lowering in perfect unison. To the Romans watching, it was like watching a mountain turn and move. Dust rose around its edges. Sunlight caught on the spear points like 1,000 mirrors. Drums thundered in rhythm, a sound that had haunted Greek nightmares for 2 centuries. Paulus galloped forward through the chaos, his cloak snapping in the wind. He saw his lines half-formed, his men confused, his flank exposed. For a heartbeat he considered retreating, letting the phalanx waste its strength in motion. But it was too late. The Macedonian wall was coming. The veteran commander had fought Samnites in ravines, Carthaginians on plains, pirates at sea. But nothing like this. Before him marched not men, but mathematics incarnate. He barked orders with the clarity of habit. Drums answered drums. The Roman maniples locked shields into improvised ranks. Scooter braced, pila poised, gladi drawn. A silence fell just before contact. That terrible silence before worlds collide. Then, impact. The front rank of the Macedonian phalanx struck the Roman line like a battering ram of iron and bone. Spears punched through shields and men together. Screams vanished beneath the rhythmic clatter of pikes. Every sarissa that fell was replaced by another behind it, a conveyor belt of death moving forward, relentless and indifferent. Paulus's left flank staggered under the weight. He rode along the lines, shouting above the din, "Hold! Close ranks!" The legion obeyed, their scooter overlapping, the formation rippling like water under a hammer. He could see it already, the difference. The phalanx advanced beautifully, perfectly, but it could only go forward. The ground beneath them was uneven, a series of slight rises and dips carved by the river. Nothing mattered yet, but Paulus took note. The sky dimmed with dust. The sun glinted off the helmets of tens of thousands locked in combat. The world had narrowed to the length of a spear, and so, with one frightened horse, and one impulsive fight, an empire's fate had begun to turn. The collision at Pydna was not a clash of men. It was the impact of 2 philosophies of war. On one side, the phalanx, an ancient organism designed for perfection. On the other, the Roman legion, a swarm of smaller minds moving with collective instinct. The first minutes belonged entirely to Macedonia. The phalanx, once locked and levelled, was unstoppable on even ground. Sarissas thrust in waves, punching through shields, flesh, and armour. The front ranks of Romans were skewered before they could even swing their swords. Those who tried to cut the shafts found only a forest of wood and death pressing down. Every step the phalanx took ground another few dozen men beneath its advance. The Romans braced, shields cracking, pila snapping, blood soaking the dust. The Macedonian line moved forward with mechanical grace, the pikes flashing like lightning across a stormy plain. From the ridge, Paulus watched the Roman front line bend like a reed. His second line surged forward to reinforce, but the sarissas pierced through them too, slicing through the illusion of control. The Romans had never faced this weapon in such mass before. The sound was monstrous. Steel scraping wood, shields splintering, the dull, wet percussion of bodies collapsing. It was like watching geometry itself devour flesh. Paulus had seen defeat before, but never this kind of precision, never death so organised. The phalanx was not an army anymore. It was a law of nature, one that punished anyone who dared stand before it. And yet, even as the Macedonians pushed forward, The cracks began to whisper beneath the noise. The terrain near the Lucas River was treacherous, not flat as Perseus believed, but rolling, uneven, marked by hidden dips and ridges. The great phalanx, stretched over kilometres, began to lose its perfect alignment. In one sector, the pikes hit a slight rise and lifted too high. In another, men stumbled into a shallow ditch. It was almost invisible to the eye, but to a Roman commander trained to see movement like a pattern, it was everything. Paulus galloped along the line, his face dark with dust and sweat. "Hold the front," he shouted, though he already knew they couldn't. The phalanx was grinding them down metre by metre, but the Roman general was not looking at what was happening, he was watching what could happen. The brilliance of the phalanx was also its curse. It demanded perfection. A single imbalance could ripple outward like a fracture through glass, and here, on this broken terrain, perfection was impossible. Paulus's instincts sparked. He had spent a lifetime fighting enemies who forced him to improvise. Now he faced one that couldn't. He turned to his officers. "They're overextended," he said quietly. "There's no mind in that line. Only motion. Find the breath between their steps." What he meant was madness. What he meant would break every Roman formation rule written since the Republic's founding. But genius, in war, often wears the mask of desperation. The order began to spread, not through trumpets, but through trust. Paulus's command was whispered, not shouted. "Break formation. Go where the ground opens." Centurions hesitated. No one disobeyed formation under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. The front lines were being chewed apart, the shields shaking under the endless jab of sarissas. To stay still meant to die in order. To move meant to live in chaos, and Rome, Paulus believed, was built to live in chaos. He ordered the maniples, those small, flexible units that made Rome's army a living organism, to detach and find their own fights. Each centurion would become a commander, each soldier a piece of independent thought within the greater body. The result was unlike anything the Macedonians had ever seen. The Roman front didn't collapse, it dissolved. Sections slipped sideways, others fell back and reappeared through gaps in the terrain. To the watching Macedonians, it looked like the enemy was breaking. To Paulus, it was the only way forward. Across the plain, the phalanx pressed on, still sure of its dominance. Perseus believed the Romans were in retreat and urged his men forward, faster, harder. But that acceleration was the final fracture. The ground near the Roman right was uneven. A small ravine, invisible from afar, ran across the slope. When the phalanx reached it, its perfect wall faltered. The rear ranks slowed, the front stumbled. Gaps, tiny breathing seams, opened between the sections of the line. Paulus saw them glinting through the dust like cracks in marble. He raised his arm. "Now!" The first maniples slipped inside the openings, small groups of men moving like predators through brush. They didn't charge the front, they vanished into the phalanx. Once inside, the world changed. The sarissas, so majestic from a distance, became useless. 6 meters of wood was a gift to an enemy with a knife. The Macedonians couldn't turn fast enough. Their formation was a doctrine, not a conversation. Once broken, it couldn't heal itself. The Romans, meanwhile, fought like water, spreading, splitting, striking wherever the terrain allowed. 1 maniple became 10, 10 became 20. Each centurion, trained for independence, turned the battlefield into a swarm of little wars. Paulus's staff watched in disbelief. What had looked like collapse now looked like transformation. The Roman army was no longer a wall. It was an infection spreading inside the phalanx, attacking it from within. All around, the sounds changed. The rhythmic pounding of pikes gave way to the brutal intimacy of close combat. Grunts, screams, the metallic gasps of the gladius striking bone. The ground turned slick with blood. The Macedonian line, once a perfect sculpture of death, began to warp. Each gap widened into a wound, each wound into a collapse. Centuries of pride, the legacy of Philip and Alexander, were being unmade, not from the outside, but from within. From his vantage point, Paulus saw it clearly now. The end of an era. The phalanx was not defeated by power or courage or luck. It was defeated by flexibility, by a system that didn't worship perfection, but prepared for its absence. Rome had not invented genius, it had systematized it. The old world of kings and glory was giving way to something colder, more efficient, more permanent, and in the dust of Pydna, the birth cry of empire echoed above the screams of the dying. Inside the phalanx the air was suffocating. The sarissas, once elegant extensions of control, had become prisons of wood. The front ranks could no longer move freely. The rear ranks pressed forward, unaware that the formation ahead was collapsing into chaos. For the Roman maniples that had slipped through the cracks, it was like fighting inside a cage of iron and flesh. There was no formation, no commands, just instinct and training. The scutum created a half-metre of life. The gladius ended whatever stood within that space. The Macedonians tried to twist their pikes around, but there was no room. The very weapon that had made them invincible now betrayed them. Its length was their doom. Soldiers dropped the sarissa, reaching for their shorter swords, but by then the Romans were already upon them. A centurion named Gnaeus led one of the first wedges. His men crashed through a loose seam, carving their way deep into the Macedonian belly. He had no view of the battlefield, no sense of the larger plan, only the sounds of splintering pikes and gurgling breaths. His command was simple: keep stabbing until the air opens. Paulus's idea had turned the field into a mosaic of horror. Pockets of tight, intimate slaughter, each maniple acting as a miniature legion. Blood ran down the uneven ground, filling the low spots where horses had once drunk. The sun caught the mist of it all, turning the battlefield gold and red. The phalanx, designed to be one perfect body, now suffered the worst fate a body can endure. It was being eaten from the inside out. The Romans didn't roar, they breathed through their teeth, methodical. The Macedonians screamed in frustration, not terror, as their discipline became useless. The more they tried to maintain formation, the more they strangled each other. Paulus rode close enough to see the difference. The phalanx's rhythm, once steady as a drum, had shattered into 100 unsynchronized beats. Dust and sweat blinded both sides, but the noise told the story. The sharp thwack of pilum, the crunch of shields slamming together, the short rhythmic chink of gladius thrusts. These replaced the old harmony of spears. In a desperate attempt to restore order, Macedonian officers shouted commands, waving their banners above the din. It was useless. No man could hear another more than a few feet away. In the gaps where Roman maniples now moved, there was no longer a phalanx, only fragments, isolated clusters surrounded by predators. A Roman soldier later described it. They were beautiful until we touched them. That was the truth of it. The phalanx had been an artwork of war, but like all art, it depended on distance. Up close, it was fragile. As the battle wore on, the slope of the terrain funneled the broken Macedonians toward the riverbed. The sarissas, dropped by the thousands, formed a jagged carpet beneath their feet. The same spears that had made kings tremble now tripped their own masters. By mid-afternoon, the wall of men was no longer a wall. It was a scattering of survivors trying to fight in every direction at once. The Roman maniples merged into larger waves, compressing what remained of the Macedonian core. Perseus, watching from the rear, could not understand what he saw. From a distance, the field still shimmered with helmets and pikes. It looked intact, but the dust hid the truth. The core of his army was already dying. He hesitated. He could have charged with his cavalry to break the Roman rhythm, to buy time for the phalanx to regroup, but fear, or pride, froze him. He waited for clarity, and clarity never came. By the time he ordered the charge, his phalanx was gone. That was the moment Rome broke not just an army, but a philosophy. The phalanx had been crystal, beautiful, symmetrical, unbending. The legion was water, shapeless, adaptive, patient, and when water meets crystal, only one survives the impact. When the Macedonian cavalry finally moved, it was too late. They galloped into chaos, unable to tell friend from foe. The phalanx had dissolved into isolated knots of men fighting to breathe, their banners swallowed by dust. Perseus, the last heir to Alexander's dream, sat astride his horse, staring at the ruin below. For a heartbeat, he seemed frozen between centuries, one foot in the age of heroes, the other in the age of systems. Around him, the noise of collapse rolled like thunder. Roman trumpets cut through the air, signalling the advance of the reserve lines. Those fresh troops didn't march, they flowed. Manipular wedges poured down the slope like a tide reclaiming the shore. Everywhere the Romans went, the fight ended the same. The gladius plunged, the scutum shoved, the formation shrank. The Macedonian front, deprived of leadership and breath, began to crumble. Paulus rode among his men, not shouting, just watching the inevitable unfold. He knew it wasn't courage that decided this battle, it was architecture. The Roman army was built to survive imperfection. The Macedonian was built to deny it. When one broke shape, it died. When the other broke shape, it adapted. As the sun began to drop behind the ridges, the plain was carpeted with bodies. 20,000 Macedonians, most killed where they stood. 6,000 more were taken prisoner. Roman losses were said to be fewer than 100, though even Paulus would later call that number merciful fiction. At the riverbank, men tried to surrender. The water ran dark with iron and blood. The sarissas lay scattered like reeds after a storm. Perseus fled. His horse stumbled through corpses and trampled shields. The king's golden cuirass was splattered with dust, his crown lost somewhere in the carnage. He rode until his soldiers no longer followed, until the cries behind him turned to silence. He found refuge in the temple of Samothrace, seeking protection from the gods who had once favoured his ancestors. The Romans found him there anyway. When they brought Perseus to Paulus, the Roman general did not celebrate. He looked at the broken king, the descendant of Alexander, and said quietly, "You were born too late." Weeks later, Perseus would walk in chains through the streets of Rome, part of Paulus's triumphal parade. Citizens cheered the end of Macedonia, children threw flowers at the chariot that carried their new hero. But Paulus sat stone-faced. He had seen the cost of this kind of victory too many times before. Perseus was sent to captivity in Alba-Fucens. He would die there alone, a king reduced to silence. Some say starvation, others say grief. The records don't care which. After Pydna, Macedonia was divided into 4 puppet republics. Its economy was stripped, its armies dissolved, its culture rewritten by decree. What had been the forge of Alexander became a museum piece under Roman supervision. The message was clear. The age of heroic kings was over. The age of institutions had begun. And in that single afternoon, Rome didn't just defeat an enemy, it buried an entire way of thinking. The world no longer belonged to the man who led from the front. It belonged to the system that could fight without him. The Mediterranean, once divided among monarchs and mercenaries, now bent toward a new master, one that conquered not with brilliance, but with patience. As the last light faded over Pydna, the echo of spears still hung in the air, but beneath it, something else was rising. The steady, measured heartbeat of empire. When the dust of Pydna finally settled, the survivors stood among 2 centuries of history reduced to silence. The Macedonian phalanx, once the symbol of unstoppable conquest, lay broken, not just in body but in concept. Men who had grown up memorizing Alexander's victories now stared at the proof that even perfection can expire. What died that afternoon was more than an army. It was a world view. For generations, war had been theatre. Choreographed brilliance, dependent on one great mind at the centre. Philip's geometry, Alexander's lightning, Pyrrhus's daring, all versions of the same faith, that one flawless plan, executed by one flawless formation, could dominate the earth. Rome disagreed. The Romans had no Alexanders, no living gods. Their genius was administrative, not divine. They didn't rely on one man to think for all. They built thousands who could think enough. Their armies didn't need perfection. They needed structure. The legion didn't believe in beauty. It believed in redundancy. That difference rewrote the world. At Pydna, when the sarissas splintered, the metaphor was complete. The long, elegant reach of Hellenistic warfare gave way to the short, ugly certainty of Roman pragmatism. Spears that had once touched the sky were replaced by swords meant for the gut. Bronze gave way to iron, heroics to hierarchy. The Macedonian soldiers died believing they had faced chaos. What they had truly faced was evolution. Paulus knew it. That's why he did not celebrate. He had seen what replaced the old order, not freedom or glory, but machinery. The legion was a machine built out of human obedience, powered by repetition, fueled by discipline. It could conquer the world, but it could not feel it. From that day, warfare became less about brilliance and more about logistics. The Roman road network, the supply lines, the discipline of record-keeping, all extensions of the same logic that had triumphed at Pydna. The individual became replaceable, the plan infinite. Rome's victory didn't just absorb Macedonia, it absorbed its ghosts. Greek art would decorate Roman villas, Greek tutors would raise Roman sons, Greek gods would find new altars in Roman temples. But the Greek way of war, the belief that courage and symmetry could outlast time, was gone. Centuries later, when Roman generals studied the old campaigns of Alexander, they saw not a mirror, but a relic. They admired him as poets admire stars, beautiful, unreachable, already dead. The battlefield at Pydna, for all its carnage, became a classroom. Military thinkers for the next 2,000 years would return to it to understand a single principle. Rigidity dies, adaptability survives. Water against glass. That was the essence of it. The phalanx was glass, hard, brilliant, but fatally dependent on clarity. The legion was water, formless, patient, capable of filling any shape. Every empire that followed Rome, knowingly or not, inherited that lesson. Modern armies still echo those maniples. Small, flexible units, delegated authority, movement before mass. Every time a soldier takes initiative without orders, every time an army adapts mid-battle, Pydna breathes again, and yet the tragedy remains. With adaptability came bureaucracy. With system came empire. The price of Rome's triumph was the death of individuality on the field, the silencing of names. When Paulus returned to Rome, they built him a triumph. Trumpets, garlands, applause. He rode through the city in a chariot, and behind him walked Perseus, chained, once a king. Children threw flowers, senators declared destiny fulfilled. But the general's eyes, witnesses said, were distant. He had seen what destiny costs. He had watched the last breath of a world that believed in men rather than systems. History remembers the date, June 22nd, 168 BC, as the fall of Macedonia. But in truth, it was the funeral of the heroic age. From then on, the Mediterranean no longer belonged to lightning. It belonged to weather, slow, inevitable, unfeeling. And as Rome marched on, its legions carried not just swords and standards, but the quiet certainty that had begun on that Thessalian plain, that evolution, not brilliance, decides who rules the world.